Story 1. I used to manage a small team at an information technology help desk. One morning, my most punctual, reliable employee did not show up. He called me 2 hours into his shift, sounding genuinely panicked. "I am so sorry. I cannot come in today. I am trapped." Me. Trapped? What do you mean, trapped? Is everything okay? Him. Yes, I am fine, but there is a moose on my porch, and it has been sleeping in front of my door for 3 hours. I cannot get out. I was completely silent, trying to process if this was an elaborate prank. I just told him to keep me updated. An hour later, he emailed me a picture from his upstairs window. There, magnificently and absurdly, was a full-grown moose, curled up and fast asleep on his front steps like a giant, antlered dog. It is the only time in my career I have had to log active moose as the official reason for an absence. Story 2. My grandparents had a medical emergency years ago where one got stuck on the toilet, and when the other tried to help, they fell and knocked themselves unconscious. My employer demanded details and did not believe me because it sounded like a Saturday Night Live skit. Story 3. True story. My vagina has a fever. I did not say this, but an older lady called in sick and that was her excuse. Story 4. Years ago, during the mob wars in St. Louis, we had a girl calling into work saying that she was behind a car that exploded on the highway. She was known for exaggerating, so we laughed it off. Turned out to be true. Story 5. I emailed the office that I would not be in for a few days because my then wife had our son in the front seat of my car on the side of the turnpike. They knew he was due any day, and we were on the way to the hospital, but he came faster than we expected. I received an email from a coworker with a link to a local news article saying, "I thought I recognized your car." Story 6. A man I worked with in retail 15 years ago called to say he had a nightmare and did not think he would be able to get back to sleep or come to work 5 hours later. Story 7. One of my daughter's primary school teachers had to take a day off because her beagle climbed onto the roof of her house. Story 8. Back in my retail days, one girl did not show up, so we called her. She said, "I forgot that I worked here," meaning she forgot she worked for our store, not that she forgot to come to work that day. It was the most insane excuse I had ever heard as a manager. She had worked with us for about 3 weeks. I just assumed she had forgotten forever because she never came back. Story 9. Decades ago, I had a shift runner for a pizza chain I managed in a large city who did not call or show up for 4 days. He came in to turn in his uniform, knowing he missed shifts and thinking he was fired. He was a medium-height, super quiet fireplug of a guy. He was 24 years old, grew up in drug-infested projects, and had a wife and 2 little girls. He was super responsible otherwise for about a year. The only thing he said was that a few years ago he borrowed some money from a guy he knew when he was out of work. He paid him back but still owed the guy who was like upper management in a regional drug hierarchy. Anyway, he said he couldn't tell me and understood if I had to fire him. I didn't, and this guy was on time like always and eventually became a store manager and moved his young family into a decent part of the city. I left the company and area not long after he got promoted, but it taught me how unrealistically hard it is to rise out of those situations, as there are always tentacles trying to pull you back. It has been 35 years, and I still think about that guy, know his name, and I hope he is doing well and has a bunch of grandkids. Story 10. A colleague called my boss one morning after an important football match. "Boss, what would happen if I came into work drunk?" "You would be fired." "Right, boss. What would happen if I called in and said I could not come in because I was drunk?" "You would get a written warning." Okay, boss. What would happen if I did not come in today but did not give you a reason?" "A verbal warning." "Thank you, boss. I will take that." Story 11. Does leaving early count? My mom closed the eyeglasses store where she was working because a fly was in her drink and got in her mouth. Story 12. My wife called me from home while I was at work one day. I asked her why she was home instead of at work, and she said, "I called in sick." I asked her what was wrong. She replied, "There is a big bug by the door." We lived in a garden apartment with only one entrance, and she could not get out because of the bug. I told her to step on it. She was too afraid. I told her to send our Jack Russell on it. The dog was definitely not afraid of bugs. So that is what she did. She took the dog over to it, pointed it out, and the dog went over to it, sniffed it, and walked away. Upon further examination, it turned out the bug was actually just a ball of loose thread. These are the dangers of not wearing your glasses, I guess. Story 13. A colleague emailed me to say he would be out of town and unable to review the materials I sent. I was frustrated because I work in print publishing, and deadlines do not accommodate vacations. I checked with another colleague to see if I should follow up by phone regardless. Turns out he was not just out of town, he was in Antarctica conducting research. Story 14. Not work, but a college class with a pretty strict attendance policy. I delivered a message to the professor that my friend could not come that day because she thought one of her guppies might give birth. To prevent cannibalism, the recommendation was to separate the babies from the adults as soon as possible. The professor accepted this as an excused absence. Story 15. Had a second shift quality assurance job in my fifth packing house. Not a government inspector, not on the production line, not a supervisor, disliked by all. Morbidly depressed after 6 months. Woke up one morning and felt great mentally and physically. Called in and said, "I am calling in well. I feel great and will not ruin it by coming to work today." Boss said, "I will have to write you up tomorrow. Have at it." Sent out a resume and left a month later. Story 16. Someone reported a bomb threat at the Walmart across the street. Police are everywhere. I am too scared to leave my house. Story 17. The person's overhead garage door remote was not working. Yes, they were aware that they could manually open the garage. However, that was not necessary because their car was not parked in the garage. The repair technician was coming to fix the remote, so they had to be there for the work. Story 18. I had a coworker call in and tell our boss he couldn't come in because his testicles were swollen from using cocaine and masturbating for 8 hours. My sister is a manager in retail, and she had an older woman call in because her hemorrhoids were acting up. The woman also sent a close-up picture of her hemorrhoids. Story 19. Forgot to change my clock for daylight saving time. We had a guy who was always 1 hour late to work on the Monday after we changed the clocks. But the guy was an idiot. He used this excuse when we set the clocks back as well as when we set them forward. By that logic, you would be an hour early one day a year and an hour late one day a year. Story 20. Ages ago, I worked at Walmart stocking groceries. One day I was just worn out, so I called in and told them that I had apathy. My supervisor, who was not very bright, did not miss a beat. He told me to rest up and be back tomorrow. The next day, his boss came over to me and said, "I'm going to let that apathy thing slide because it was hilarious, but don't ever do it again." Story 21. I once got to work and then received a panicked call from my father, saying I needed to come back to my house immediately because he was stuck. He refused to provide more details. I informed my boss that I would hopefully be back soon and that I would keep her posted. I was worried because, a few months earlier, he had been in his backyard practicing karate moves on an old tree. When he kicked it, the rotten tree fell on top of him. He couldn't reach his phone and spent about an hour trying to wiggle out of his pants to escape. I assumed a similar situation might have occurred. I rushed back home to find that he had decided to cut down tree limbs while I was gone. He used a ladder to climb onto the shed roof for more working space. The problem was he also brought my sister's dog, who promptly knocked over the ladder as soon as he got up there. Story 22. Their neighbor's house was broken into, and they shot the intruder. They could not leave because police tape surrounded their property, and the mobile investigation vehicle was blocking their driveway. He said he heard what sounded like a couple of thumps early in the morning and assumed the neighbor dropped something. It was the sound of his neighbor's .357 revolver being discharged, followed by the intruder hitting the ground. Story 23. It was opening day of the school year, and I was in our home office typing up my classroom expectations. Suddenly, I felt something on my head accompanied by a high-pitched scream. It was a bat entangled in my hair. My husband somehow got it out while I collapsed onto the floor, trying to breathe from sheer panic. After half an hour of trying to compose myself, I called our principal and told him what had happened and that I would be late, as my nerves needed to settle before I could drive the 1.5 hour commute. When I arrived in time for my third period class of nervous, brand new freshmen and explained why I was late, the looks on their faces were memorable. Story 24. I called out once because there was a scorpion in my bed that stung me more than 10 times, and I was in a helicopter being medically evacuated. I called out once because a pack of javelinas was encircling my car. I called out once because a mother cougar was hanging out on my back wall with a baby on the ground. I called out once because a saguaro cactus fell onto my house, and I had to prove to the federal authorities that I did not knock it over. I called out on 2 separate occasions because I got stuck in a hurricane and missed my flight home. I called out once because I was helping rescue a friend's horses from a wildfire moving toward their ranch. I think that's pretty much it for my wild excuses. I don't really get sick, so I don't call out unless I really cannot get to work. Story 25. One man said he could not come in because his goldfish was depressed and he needed to be there emotionally. Story 26. I had an employee whose boyfriend stole her car. When he learned the police were going to come after him for selling methamphetamine, the car broke down. Some good Samaritans stopped to help him. He stole their car and crashed it. Finally, the police caught up with them. Anyway, all she really needed to say was that her car had broken down. He also would sneak into the gated parking lot to try and sell methamphetamine. Once he got into the building somehow, we never figured out how, and flushed all of the methamphetamine down the toilet, flooding the break room and a manager's office. Story 27. An employee called to say he could not come in because his dog had urinated in his shoe and he only had 1 pair. Story 28. I once heard a coworker called sunburnt. It was unusual, but to be fair, she was very light-skinned, so I imagine it was quite serious. Story 29. A coworker was absent without notice for his shift. He had been experiencing emotional issues, so our department manager attempted to call him several times. After no response, he checked his home and then requested a wellness check from the local police department. There was no sign of him. A few hours later, the coworker called to say that his mother had died. A few hours after that, he called back to say that she had not actually died and that he had made a mistake. That was the last time anyone heard from him. Story 30. I had a friend call and put a towel on the phone. He said he had been abducted and placed in a car trunk. Story 31. Anal glaucoma. When the boss asked, "What is that?" he responded, "It's when you just can't see your behind coming into work," and hung up. Story 32. A man called in 3 hours into a 5-hour shift because he overslept. His reason was that the latest Call of Duty game was released the day before, and he stayed up until 7 a.m. playing. The boss told him not to bother coming back. The kicker: the shift did not start until noon. Story 33. My sister was a school teacher and called in saying that she was not feeling well enough to come to work. However, she started to feel worse and would likely be in the next day. Unsurprisingly, they did not renew her contract. Story 34. Someone once called me and said he could not come in because he was sprayed with mace. He also called about 5 hours after his shift started. Story 35. There was a woman who worked with us who often had unusual excuses. She would call in saying she couldn't find any shoes. She also called in because she left her clothes at the laundromat and was unable to pay for the dryer. She would leave at 11 a.m., come back at 3 p.m., then go home for lunch and had to go to the grocery store for food. She had a flat tire every other week. Her prescription glasses were lost, so she couldn't see well enough to drive. She once called out because she received free tickets to Disneyland from her neighbor, and they were about to expire. She wore unusual wigs and had an unpleasant odor. Her lunches at work were always odd combinations of leftover food that smelled very bad. Story 36. I once had a coworker who was the sweetest person but not the brightest. She was running late in the morning and called in. We heard our supervisor laugh really hard. I happened to be friends with both of them. The supervisor shared that she was late because she said she had a broken toe, but she mistakenly called it a camel toe. We all laughed a lot. The sweet coworker thought her broken toe was called a camel toe. We had a great laugh explaining to her what a camel toe actually is. It still makes me chuckle just thinking about it. Story 37. A coworker once got into a minor fender bender and ended up going to jail. He caused the accident and assaulted the other driver for damaging his car. It seems. Another person called in saying he was snowed in. There were maybe, if I am being generous, 3 inches of snow on the ground, and he lived less than a block away. The boss said okay. Story 38. I had a large commercial truck with a bucket on top blocking my driveway. I took a picture and sent my supervisor the photo, informing them that I would be late. Story 39. I had a colleague call out because she ran out of toilet paper. She is probably still sitting on the toilet. Story 40. I got stuck in my detached garage once because the garage door broke. I couldn't lift it by myself and had to wait for help. Story 41. They did not have any pants. They have 5 pairs of pants, and they are all dirty. They talked about this for a few minutes. Story 42. Back in my banking days, we had a part-time teller working at our office. She was 18, still lived at home with her parents, and I'm pretty sure this was her first job. The day after a minor snowstorm, she called out of work, saying she lived at the top of a hill and her parents were not comfortable with her driving down the hill that day. She was still at home the next day. As it turned out, she never returned to work, and the bank's security team had to send a registered letter to her home to retrieve her bank keys. Story 43. One of my colleagues said that one of his employees could not come to work because she was the escape vehicle driver when her boyfriend robbed a bank and they both were arrested. Story 44. His dog was mating with another dog. He tried to stop it, but it growled and tried to bite him, so he had to wait until it finished and consequently missed the bus. Story 45. I had a coworker call in and say he could not make it in because he was stabbed 13 times. Another called in and said he could not make it in because he was hit by a car, but he would be in tomorrow because he was able to jump and roll up the window. Several people called in because their homes were on fire during the wildfires that burned the city, including myself. We had a coworker secretly living in the storage room in the manager's office for about a month during that situation. He was insane. Story 46. I had a girl call into work. Her father was in a standoff with the police, and she and her mother were asked to come and try to talk him down. I believed her because I had been watching the news that morning and was well aware of the situation. The last names were the same. Story 47. A tornado touched down nearby and knocked a tree across my driveway, missing cars but blocking us in. We did not live in a tornado-frequent location, and my boss did not believe me. This was before smartphones, so I had to take a picture, get it developed, and show him a week or two later to validate my call-out. Looking back, I could have just lied and said I was sick to save myself the entire fiasco, but it was such a unique experience that I naively assumed it was a valid reason and would be interesting to share. Story 48. I was a supervisor at a company. Somebody called in and said he cannot come to work because the swells are unusually large and he needs to go surfing. This was in Northeast England, by the way. Story 49. My husband's colleague called in because he was too overweight to get into his work trousers. He had been on an all-inclusive holiday for 2 weeks, came home, and couldn't get his trousers up. His boss made him come in wearing his holiday shorts and agreed that he did look significantly bigger. The boss gave him a few days off while new trousers were ordered for him. He had apparently gained 18 pounds in 2 weeks. Story 50. My ex-fiancée, a teacher, phoned to say she had a headache. Then she rolled a joint and played Grand Theft Auto for all day. Miss you, Lou. Story 51. A man who spoke broken English told my boss, I cannot work. You have hemorrhoids. We understood the message. Story 52. A man who worked in the post office in Montauk came into some money. The next day he called in late because his hair was still wet. Story 53. A former coworker was limping at our workplace in a depot, and everyone was wondering what happened. He left shortly afterward. It turned out he was intimate with his girlfriend and injured himself during the act. Story 54. I had to call off once because I got sprayed in the face by a skunk. I also had to call off once because I was in the emergency room from a tegobite. Another time, I had to call off because a raccoon stole and lost my keys. I run an animal rescue, so they expect that from me. Story 55. She said, I think I am getting a headache. Not, I have one. She called out multiple times during her first week, and we let her go. She did not understand why. Story 56. I supervised a call center, and our employee entrance was on the side of the building with one flight of about 15 steps. The customer entrance was in front, but to keep that area clear, we had employees use the steps on the side of the building. One employee, for whatever reason, strongly objected to using the steps. She raised several what-if scenarios, assuming we had not provided reasonable accommodation for disabilities. This was not the case, as we had an employee who used a cane and was able to use the front entrance and elevator. She eventually made a formal complaint to Human Resources. Human Resources informed her of the procedure to document any need for reasonable accommodation. Since she could not do that, she began calling out sick with excuses such as, "My knee is sore, so I'm calling out. I worked my hamstrings yesterday, and they hurt, so I'm calling out. I walked more than usual last night, and my legs are tired, so I'm calling out." She ultimately called Human Resources and formally quit, citing the flight of stairs as her primary complaint. Story 57. I didn't call in but got called to ask if I was okay because it was 10:30 a.m. and I hadn't logged on yet. I work remotely. I had been diagnosed with a rare condition a few months earlier and nearly died, so he was truly concerned. Meanwhile, I had been in my backyard working on my landscaping for the past 2 hours and wondering why he was calling me on a Sunday. When I asked him that, he said it was Monday. I stopped and reviewed what I had been doing the last couple of days and was still convinced it was Sunday. Finally, I looked at my phone and saw that it was indeed Monday. Thankfully, due to working remotely, I was logged on in about 10 minutes, still not entirely convinced it was Monday. The weirdest time lapse ever. Story 58. I had to call and report that I lost power, and the emergency release was stuck, so I could not get out of the garage. They were initially doubtful, but after checking the website for power outages, they had to believe me when my area appeared. Story 59. We had a girl call the attendance number to let us know she would not be in that day. 2 issues with that. First, she called the wrong crew, and second, she had been terminated 2 weeks prior. Story 60. My coworker called in because the rod in his closet fell. He wanted to fix it and rehang his suits so he would not have to pay the dry cleaner to iron them again. Story 61. Not a worker, but a parent called in an absence for her daughter because the girl had worms coming out of her bottom. Story 62. Once worked with a man who called out because he had a large pimple on his buttocks, and it hurt so much he could not sit, walk, or do much of anything. Totally valid, we worked retail and it would have been painful, but we made fun of him lightheartedly and told him he should have lied. Story 63. I once could not go to work because there was an unexploded bomb found on my street. I lived at the end, so I could not get around the cordon, and the soldier told me to stay indoors. So I did. Lovely day off. I told my partner to start digging in our garden to see if we could make it a long weekend. Story 64. I drank too much coffee and I feel terrible. It was an 11 to 7 job. It was me and it was true. I was a phlebotomist and loved my job, but I worked with needles. I don't think any patient would have wanted me drawing their blood that night. Story 65. Not a complaint, but the number of people who call to reschedule their appointments when rain is expected is incredible. Story 66. A delivery driver at a small local durable medical equipment store called in because he had to go to a pool tournament with his friends. I completed his termination paperwork while still taking the call. Story 67. A lady put mayonnaise in her hair to condition it. It did not rinse out thoroughly with water. No matter how many times she washed it again, it looked greasy. Story 68. I had someone who couldn't control both ends of their body. It happens. But they decided to leave me a voicemail with every single detail and noise coming from their body in the background while they were leaving the message. Just call in sick and I will think nothing of it. Story 69. I have a coworker who took a whole week off because it was her birthday. As someone who grew up in a household where you go to work unless you are dead, one of my parents' mottos, I found this amusing. Story 70. Back in 2015, I worked at a call center. I sat close to the manager's desk and overheard a guy call out with dysentery. Story 71. Her. Mother Nature has come to call. Me. Sorry. Her. Mother Nature. Me. Is that an illness or something? I just have to write something on the clipboard. Her. It's Mother Nature. So I wrote Mother Nature on the clipboard. Someone later informed me that it means menstrual cramps. Story 72. A coworker called in to take her mother to rehabilitation. They found her in the woods at 3 a.m., barefoot, yelling at a tree. It was 32 degrees outside. They did not want to waste any time, obviously. Her mother is doing well now, for years sober. Good for her. Story 73. Just heard this last week. A coworker said she felt bullied by someone from her team asking her a question on a department call. She went to lunch, then told her manager she was taking paid time off for the rest of the day and the next. The question was, can you trade lunch times next Wednesday? Story 74. Her overweight sister fell, and she was the only person who could lift her off the floor. The girl who had to lift her weighed no more than 100 pounds. Story 75. Why didn't you call and wake me up? I heard this from a 20-something employee who worked for me. Apparently, his previous supervisor used to do that for him. Story 76. When I lived near Pittsburgh, I had a friend who worked the front desk at a day labor agency that served many mentally unstable or homeless individuals. He texted me one morning to say that one of his most unstable and unhoused workers called out because he had to take top-secret government documents to the Canadian Embassy. Story 77. This person was trapped in their home because there was a large insect on their front door. It was a crane fly, also known as a mosquito hawk. Story 78. The man was late, not absent. The boss asked, "Why are you late?" He replied, "I don't know, because my shirt is green." Story 79. I'm just going to admit one I used one time. I wanted to have more sex with my girlfriend instead of going to work, and my leg had gone numb for whatever reason. I thought I would get the answering machine, so I did not have any excuse ready, and my boss answered the phone. I told them I could not come to work because I could not feel my legs. It is one of those random memories that gives me embarrassment decades later in the middle of the night. Story 80. I once had to call out of work because the police had blocked my driveway. A police car was across the end of my driveway with no officers around, and there was no way to get around it. Turned out they had an incident, and one officer jumped into a different vehicle, possibly an ambulance, and left the car behind. Story 81. Legitimate reasons I have used. Dropped my keys in the dog's water bowl, which damaged the remote, and I couldn't turn off the alarm. Geese would not let me get to my car. Horses got out. Reasons others have used. Got abducted by extraterrestrials. Came in as soon as they released him. Girlfriend is pregnant. Had to take care of it before wife found out. Spoiler alert, his wife found out. Too intoxicated to drive in the morning. Story 82. A coworker of mine. I am pretty sure he did not call in, just never came back. He was arrested for kidnapping on his way home from work. During the criminal investigation, it was discovered that he was also a suspect in the mysterious disappearance of a female gas station attendant and the shooting death of a female jogger. He is now serving a life sentence. Story 83. I had to call my supervisor and tell her I was going to be late because chipmunks had filled my truck's engine with black walnuts. She laughed so hard I thought she was going to choke. When I went to leave, I started the truck and heard an awful sound. I opened the hood and the engine was full of black walnuts. I had to get the little stepladder and spent half an hour cleaning them all out. Luckily, I was only about half an hour late, and it was the early morning stocking shift, so it was all good. Story 84. Worked with a man who slipped and fell on ice in the parking lot and was out for several months with an injury. On the first day he returned, he sat through the morning meeting and then told the manager he could not work because his hair hurt. He then turned around and left. Story 85. I once called to request working from home that day because I was expecting a delivery of highly perishable goods. Story 86. A manager who was dismissed from multiple companies could always find a new position. He had a go-to list, and once he started a new job, he would use the list without repeating excuses. My favorite was, I saw a rare bird in my backyard and contacted the Department of Natural Resources. They need me to stay home until someone arrives, so I can show them where the bird was and the direction it flew. Another excuse was, my garage door is frozen, and I can't get to my car. If anyone got sick in the office, he would call in a few days later, saying he must have caught the illness from that person, but his symptoms were worse and he needed more days off. He also had a list of deceased relatives. Sometimes he would provide a memorial card from a funeral home, always the same one where his wife worked as a secretary. He lasted at the company for almost 3 years before he was dismissed. Story 87. One of my husband's employees did not show up, so they were concerned and called her. She had gone on a drinking weekend and insisted over the phone that it was Sunday morning, not Monday as it actually was, and asked why they were calling her when she was off the clock. He recorded her excuse as thought Monday was Sunday. Story 88. My boyfriend, after 3 months at his current job, called out on Saturday because I ended up in the emergency room with cardiac issues. He also had to call out on Sunday because his mother dislocated her finger badly. It was bent at a 90-degree angle sideways and bleeding, and we had to take her to the emergency room an hour before his shift. I told him to take pictures of both of our discharge papers because no one would believe this otherwise. Those were the only 2 days he was scheduled that week. Thankfully, his supervisors were understanding and told him to take care of us and himself, basically wrapping us in bubble wrap until after his next shift. Story 89. Super Bowl Sunday, 1999. At approximately 10 a.m., I looked my boss square in the eyes and told him that I had an accident and needed to go home. Story 90. A highway overpass had to be demolished due to significant damage from a crash involving a tractor-trailer, a fuel truck, and another vehicle. The highway was closed in both directions. Alternate routes became congested as well. Yes, this actually happened. Story 91. I gave one once. My car caught fire on the Benjamin Franklin Bridge. Even better, I was stranded for several hours. Some fun. Story 92. A dump truck on Interstate 35 dumped its contents, and she could not get off at an exit because there was a special weapons and tactics standoff at the exit closest to her, so she could not make it to work. You would think that much action on a freeway in the downtown area of a major city would have made the news. No, somehow, she was the only person experiencing these issues on the same freeway all her coworkers were on. Story 93. A colleague wore jeans every day. One day he arrived late wearing smart clothes because he had obviously been at a job interview. We asked why he was dressed like that, and he said his mother had not ironed his jeans. Story 94. I burned my foot very badly on my George Foreman grill, and I now need someone to come and bring me to work. Story 95. Oh my God. I cannot believe I almost forgot. I sprained my ankle chasing a dog after the dog got sprayed by a skunk in my yard at 2 a.m. I did not get any sleep because I had been washing the dog, and then around 7 a.m., I went to the emergency room to get checked out. Story 96. I once called my boss sobbing. She could barely understand me as I explained I couldn't come to work because I lost my chicken on the bus. She was so confused and perplexed that we never spoke of it again. To add some context, I worked in nursing at the time. I had just finished a surprise 16-hour shift and needed to take medication to sleep in order to return to work in less than 8 hours. I didn't have time to go grocery shopping, so I bought deli chicken at Safeway. I left my purse on the bus home because I was so tired, leaving me without chicken and locked out of my house at 20 years old. And people wonder why there is a nursing shortage. Story 97. My boss's hamster allegedly died, and she had to take the body to the veterinarian for cremation. Driving back late to the office, she spotted a traveler horse in a field that looked in poor condition, so she had to phone the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and wait with the horse until they arrived. Her boss was not impressed. Story 98. I was working for a law firm, and one of our interns, who was a train wreck, called me. Everyone called me. I was the problem solver. It went like this. He was supposed to be at work at 7:30 a.m., Around noon, I had covered for him in the morning, but this was before cell phones around 1996. I got a collect call and accepted it. He said, "Hey, I have a problem." I said, "I know you no-showed, and your boss is upset." He said, "Well, this is worse. I got really drunk at happy hour yesterday. My girlfriend locked me out of our house because she told me to grow up, so I got drunker, jumped into the fountain downtown, cut my heel practically off, tied it up with my shirt, thought I'd catch a train to the hospital. This is in a town with no public train service and limited bus service. You really need to help me. We are in Thomasville, Georgia." He said, "I'm bleeding to death. My leg is broken." At that point, I heard, "Sir, let me speak." I talked to security, who arranged an airlift to Vanderbilt Hospital. He had hopped on a freight train, fell asleep, woke up in Nashville a bloody mess, and almost lost his leg. 3 days later, he left the hospital. His sister brought him back, and his boss had set up a train on his desk. Story 99. I worked a part-time job that I did not care for much. I had been there about a month and had a vacation coming up. We were leaving on Tuesday. I called in on Monday so I could mow, pack, and get things ready to leave. The manager asked why I was not coming in. I did not want to lie, so I said, "I have to get ready for my vacation." He was upset. I never went back after the vacation, nor did I inform them that I was not coming back. Story 100. My uncle-in-law used to work at my shop. He called off one day because he said he dropped a Gatorade bottle on his toe and that it hurt too much to stand. This was my favorite in a long line of questionable reasons for why he could not show up. Story 101. My coworker sliced her finger while cooking at home the night before. No, she did not need or seek stitches. She came into work and left almost immediately because her finger was wrapped in gauze like a thick sausage and she could not type. Story 102. The funniest one I have heard was when my colleague did not come in for his shift until he was 5 hours late because he was winning a StarCraft tournament. Story 103. I got stoned on my lunch break one day, and when I came back, my eyes were very red. I knew I could not get away with it, and we had a corporate visit at the time. So, I hid in the bathroom for about 10 minutes, then left and texted my boss saying I had a stomach issue and had to go home. I told them I had eaten a bag of red hot Cheetos that did not agree with me. Story 104. The guy in the cubicle next to me called out one Monday because he was lost in the woods all weekend. He went camping with friends on Saturday night, who somehow left without him, and he ended up wandering around the woods until around 3 a.m. Monday morning. This was eastern Massachusetts, not exactly the frontier. He was about 2 miles from town, just careless and unprepared. Story 105. A man called saying his wife was at the hospital giving birth. The following week, he called again with the same excuse. Story 106. Not a work absence, but lateness instead. On one of the main roads to where I work, there is a turtle crossing sign. One person claimed he was late because he had to wait for a turtle to cross the road. In reality, if there is a turtle crossing the road, you carefully drive around the turtle and try not to hit it. This person acted as if all traffic must stop for a turtle until it completely crosses the road, like in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Story 107. Overheard a voicemail from a mechanic I worked with. He was trying to put on a sick voice to call out, but he was standing too close to the casino floor. He was calling in sick to his job in Boulder, Colorado from the Las Vegas Strip. Story 108. A man called in saying he needed to take a half day off because he apparently overdosed. I told him to maybe take the whole day, and I would just pay him for it. We never discussed it again when he came back to work. Story 109. I called off work because our garage had partially collapsed on my car. My boss wanted me to come into work anyway, as it could not have been that dangerous. She never believed us when we called off. My car was the only thing keeping the garage up so we could get my dad's car out, as well as his tools. We had the biggest snowfall in our area in years, and they ended up sending everyone home from work a few hours after the start because the ceiling was threatening to collapse from the weight. Story 110. It was my freshman year, and I was taking an 8 a.m. statistics course taught by a strict, no-nonsense older professor. The classroom was on a different campus than where I lived, so I needed to take a bus. To be comfortable, I had to be awake by 6 a.m. One night, I went to bed at 10 p.m., and since it usually takes me a while to fall asleep, I was finally drifting off around 11 p.m. 2 hours later, I was awoken by the fire alarm blaring. Everyone had to evacuate the dorm, head to a common area, and wait for clearance from the fire department. At 1 a.m., I was wide awake in the student commons. It took about an hour for the fire department to determine everything was fine. We were allowed back in at 2 a.m. after they found that the alarm was triggered because a student had left a bag of popcorn in the microwave, and it caught fire. In my sleep-deprived state, I decided I wasn't going to wake up in 3 to 4 hours to attend statistics class. I emailed my professor a barely coherent message explaining what happened and that I wouldn't be in class because I suspected I wouldn't be able to learn anything. To my surprise, the next morning I received a reply saying he understood and sent me his notes for the day. When I saw him in person again, he laughed and said he got many bogus excuses but appreciated my honesty and agreed that if I wasn't feeling it, it was okay to skip class. The moral of the story is to be honest with your professors. Story 111. A male employee called off because his wife was pregnant and he was experiencing morning sickness. He requested accommodations to arrive late to work for the duration of his wife's pregnancy because of his morning sickness. Story 112. A man who worked for me for only a few months had a few good excuses. Some were normal reasons for missing work, like missing the bus or similar situations, but he quickly cycled through those and moved on to more unusual scenarios to justify being late or not showing up without notice. One time, he said an elderly neighbor had a heart attack on the lawn outside their building. He performed CPR and called an ambulance, which is why he couldn't call us because he was on the phone. Shortly after, he did not call or show up at all. When he arrived the next day, he said he was at home, slipped on a puddle of urine from his puppy, hit his head, and passed out. He said he decided to just sleep it off and did not call us. He never went to the hospital and showed no bruising or signs of injury on his face or head. We all knew he was an aggressive alcoholic. There were multiple times he showed up appearing drunk with alcohol on his breath. He was very intimidating to me, bigger and about a decade older, so I felt uneasy disciplining him as his manager. The day he arrived late and we finally decided to fire him, I left and went to another nearby warehouse location so I did not have to do it myself. No regrets. Story 113. They went home with the wrong twin and were trying to figure out how to resolve the situation without upsetting the family. Story 114. Not me, but my mother. One of her employees once called her to say she would not be coming to work because her car was on fire. This employee had been caught lying before with very obvious things, so my mother did not believe her at first. However, the story was verified as true because it was on the local news on television that night. Story 115. It was the honesty. He was in the accident and emergency department because he had gotten up late and fell down the stairs trying to put his pants on. Story 116. A man called me at work and said he had to get a boil lanced next to his anus. I told him he did not have to go into that much detail. Story 117. He was experiencing discomfort. He called in at least once a week for years, and it was somehow allowed. Story 118. Pretty close. A friend of mine had to call in absent to work because between his front door and his truck was an apple tree, and having a delightful morning snack on his apple tree was a grizzly bear. Story 119. A squirrel got into my attic and fell down between the studs of my bedroom wall. I heard it scratching and crying, so I cut a hole in the wall and tried to get it to climb into a cat carrier I had. That did not work, and it was now loose in my house. I chased it all over the house while my mom stood on the couch screaming, and one of our two cats was going after it. Meanwhile, I was supposed to be at work. I finally realized this and had my mom call my manager. I eventually caught the squirrel and released it into the tree line near my job at the time. Unbeknownst to me, my manager, everyone on duty, and customers watched me release the squirrel, and when I walked in, I received a standing ovation. Then about a dozen people at different times during the shift asked me to tell the story. Story 120. My father had a fatal heart attack at age 80, his third, so we knew it could happen. He had never been a sick man and had always worked. The night he died, I asked my mother if he was supposed to work that week. Yes, the next day. The following morning, I called his employer and identified myself, saying that he had died, and then I started laughing. I wasn't calling him in sick. I was calling him in dead. The receptionist did not find it funny, but it was completely my father's type of humor. Story 121. One person I worked with had many unusual excuses, so we kept a list among ourselves. One of the most memorable was when he claimed to find a dead cat behind his toilet, even though he did not have a cat. Story 122. I once had to ask off so I could drive my stepfather-in-law to the airport because his twin brother, whom nobody including my mother-in-law knew about, had been lost at sea. He needed to work with the Coast Guard to handle the paperwork to have him declared dead. A few weeks later, the body washed up, and I had to help him get to and from the airport so he could identify it. It sounded like a soap opera. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.